seated and ongoing connection to the land and the waterways. And just really want to welcome you into this really interesting space that I didn't know was here until a couple of weeks ago, and I had to quickly find a space to hold what I thought was going to be 2 or 3 people chatting about this interesting case study I read, and it turned out to be a few more people who were interested, so that's great. I'm Cal. I am a strategic designer. I spent the last year or so working for the youth health team at the Burnett Institute, and I'm moving back to consultancy soon. I came at this from the angle of social connection, currently doing a PhD in how co-design can help build social connection among young people. So I'm super interested in all the kind of participatory stuff. And the origin story of this whole event was basically, I saw this case study, shared it on LinkedIn. Heaps of people started commenting on it. Got kind of tagged with Kate, who wrote the case study, and Dan. We were going to just have a quick chat about what was going on. It ballooned into something a little bit bigger, but it just made me really excited to see that so many people were interested in talking about this. So the way it's going to run today, it's pretty loose. We're going to have some kind of light presentations from Kate and Dan, and then we're going to have about 45 minutes of kind of small group discussion, networky type stuff at the end. We've got folks on Zoom, so I will try and check in with the chat there. We'll also have time for questions with everyone as well. So I will just introduce the folks who'll be talking today, and I might get them to actually introduce themselves. So Kate, do you want to introduce yourself and kind of how you got interested in this space?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone. And here's my microphone. I am only 4 weeks tomorrow back in Melbourne, actually. I've been living in Berlin for almost the last 3 years, locked in during the pandemic. And over there, I was working as a designer and research specialist, working with a group called the Democratic Society. And we worked a lot with governments, civil society, communities, etc., on complex issues such as energy, mobility, climate, democracy-related issues as they were. And now that I'm back, I'm a senior systems designer, or whatever you want to call it. Let's just say designer, okay? At Street. And Street is a social enterprise based in Collingwood that I'm sure a number of you would have heard of. It's actually because of Street that I'm here today, because Beck Scott from Street, who's the founder of Street, that I'm sure some of you know, told me about Participatory City when I was doing some work with them back in 2020. And she said, you know what, this is the kind of thing we would really love to see here in Melbourne. I think we've got the infrastructure for it. I think we've got the conditions for it. And then I was doing a piece on artificial intelligence strategy for the Scottish government when I was with DemSoc. And they wanted to know about participation in actually putting strategies into action, as opposed to participation to produce a strategy, right? So we did all these kind of case studies of different examples. For the record, it's really hard to find examples of participation in strategic implementation, but it gave me the opportunity to actually go and explore this with Participatory City. They have 2 reports that total over 400 pages. And in those pages, I saw the name of Dan Hill. And so I kind of parked that in my mind because I was aware of Dan through Twitter, basically, met through Twitter. And anyway, long story short, I wrote it up as a case study for this thing called Democracy Next 10, the next 10 years of democracy, things we need to think about. Put it out there, and then a bunch of people were like, this is very interesting, and it ended up on LinkedIn, as Callan said, and I was like, yeah, I wrote that. It's cool, huh? Like the story of this place, like, you know, it's really interesting. And then he's like, how did it get funded? I said, well, ask Dan. I believe he lives in Melbourne. I think we need to talk to him. And so, yeah, yeah. And so that's basically why I'm here today. But I think one of the things I wanted to stress with Callan about this session is, I wasn't directly involved in this project at all. This is an opportunity to share things that are very interesting, I think, for us to connect with potentially here in Melbourne, and the different sort of qualities of these participatory ecosystems. And I'm super interested to actually hear mainly what the group has to say. I think it's less about kind of like presenting on this thing that I didn't actually do. It's like a book club. You're like, I read this thing and it was cool. And then, you know, just bounce ideas around and see what we can form up. So that's me. So thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'll pass to Dan.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Dan Hill. I'm the director of Melbourne School of Design, which is the graduate school in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning up the road at Melbourne Uni. I've been here about 6 months, so a complete veteran of Melbourne now compared to Kate. Not really, because she lived here before me. It's funny you mentioned meeting on Twitter. Those were the days.
Yeah.
Before, exactly. Before it became a hellhole. Yeah, I'm a designer by background, an urbanist, I suppose. So my work is to do with cities and things. And so I'm going to talk in a minute a bit about participation and its relationship with cities and places. So it's a specific take on it. That's not the only way, obviously, you can think about participation, but it's one of the complex and tricky ways of working with participation. And I'll talk through some projects in a moment very quickly. We're going to do about 10 minutes each, really, of just some scene setting, and then Callan's probably going to ask us some difficult questions, which is great. My relationship with Participatory City Foundation, or Everyone Every Day, is that I was a trustee of that for about, I forget now, 3 or 4 years maybe. So I was on the board of trustees there. And along with a bunch of other really, really good people. And so we were looking after the thing from a kind of governance point of view and advising on its direction. And of course, we're getting regular feedback from the team running it. But I want to sort of give credit where it's due. Tessie Britton in particular was the founding and driving force through that. It still is to some extent as well. And so we were working very closely with Tessie and then her top team, people like Nat Diffrend and others. And so we were highly involved in the project, which we'll talk about in a bit, and everything from what happened when someone broke in once and stole some stuff from the till, all the way through to how do we scale this across the world, and all points in between. So we can talk to that a little bit, I guess. Yeah, what else to say? I think just to say that I'm back in Australia. I haven't been in Europe for 10 years. I lived in Australia before, in Sydney. I'm from the UK originally. And in those years in between, I worked in Finland and Sweden and Italy and the UK. And it's always been work to do with, one way or another, participation, I think, and how people get involved in shaping their own world and what they might, the practices of that, the ins and outs of that, the difficulties of doing that, but also the huge potential in participative work, whether that's so the deep participation of owning or at least being shared responsibility for things and places and structures and landscapes and things like that, all the way through to kind of forms of consultation or basic representation. So I'll talk about that something in a minute. But is there anything you want to say before we? Let's get into it. Exactly. Let's see if this works. Weak or no signal, I won't take personally. So yeah, I'm just going to do like 10 minutes very quickly. If that's right. You can still hear me okay. So to have in mind what I think about often with participation in this context, and the one we were working with Everyone Every Day as well, was how do we take everyday environments and hold them up as questions, almost like ways that places could be, and enable others, being really assailed by this mozzie, but enable the people that live there to shape their environment. So I'm interested in the sort of, to some extent, the mundane details of kit, the bits of pieces and the environments that you can work with. My colleague Rory Hyde, who's a professor at the School of Design, did this quick sketch. This is Sunbury, I think, or a bit of Sunbury in Melbourne suburbs. And just beginning to look at the built fabric that's there, which is has many values actually. So I don't want to in any way demonize the suburbs here. So somehow I think that it is what Melbourne is, and we have to figure out ways of working with that positively and optimistically. At the same time, we can say that these things are they're very difficult. They're very highly privatized or individualized places. They don't have public transport. The public realm is not what you get in nice bits like Collingwood or whatever. It's just. It really is. It can lead to a withdrawing rather than a participating in, and so that's an issue. But what Rory scribbled there like architects do. I can say that because he's not in the room. Hello, Roy. It's, you know, potential changes like a nursery in the background there, a kind of smart grid, a co-working space, and some kind of factory, some shared water treatment and sewage storage at that scale, car share, solar charging. You can see energy at that scale. Well, that's what's interesting, though, that some of these bits and pieces, bits of infrastructure, stuff like energy and water, which previously were these huge scale systems, like the energy in this room, who knows where it comes from, I don't know, quite possibly a coal-fired power plant in country Victoria, right? Massive scale system that then leads to a very centralized, non-participative model. You only participate as a consumer, which is not really participating at all. This stuff could be reversed. And so, you know, we can start thinking about, well, how do people actually own their own or share their own energy at the scale of their street or neighborhood or block? And that enables a kind of participation in making energy and sharing it, which is really interesting, and kind of social and cultural and complex. It's not just a bunch of electrons coming in through the wall, and it puts all kinds of other possibilities on the table. So you can do that with housing. This is cooperative housing in Zurich, and it's entirely built without property developers. So, you know, but you can see quite large scale, and it's just a bunch of people like you, but Swiss, in a room, deciding to work together on something, and then you get a collective mortgage from the bank, essentially, and you institute a cooperative for the building, and the city makes that land available to you at a reasonable rate. And you find an architect, of course. It's really a beautiful building in lots of ways. It's got a cinema in it, it's got nurseries, it's got massive big playground, is open to the street, so it's public and it's private, but the apartments are really good. But these are 25% cheaper than market rates because you're not, there's no property developer again, so there's no profit margin required. You know, any investor, you're collectively owning it essentially. So anything you're paying into it is shared by everybody else. And so this sometimes seems like nirvana when you show this in Victoria, but there are loads of these all over the world. And there are things a bit like this here as well, of course, like Nightingale and Assemble to some degree, and you know, other things like that. So these are interesting. And then there's even other types of participation, like making your own house. Now, this is called the Siegel method by Walter Siegel. These are in London. And these were kind of kit houses or just a building system that enable people to put together a house themselves, again, with very basic building skills required. They're super well done, they're insulated and all of that stuff. So this is real participation again. It's generally from the community up, totally plausible houses. They're actually really high quality, actually, and they're adaptable over time. Some of these are really beautiful if you look at them. So it's all right. So it's this is real participation in making a house. You know, it's a very different thing. And then there's the energy thing I talked about. These are in Western Australia. Solar cells on the roof, battery in the basement. It's at the scale of the housing itself. There's no, you know, it's effectively off grid, but it's in the middle of a city, which is, or in Perth suburbs. So that's interesting and it's complex. And, you know, you start thinking about energy then as a social kind of function as well. It's not just electrons coming from the wall. I don't know where they came from or who made them, right? But if I'm living next door to Nicole, then it's our energy from our system. And it's, you know, Nicole, if you use all the energy up tonight and I can't watch the Champions League and I'm going to be really annoyed, you know. So suddenly there's this social overlay onto energy, which we haven't had to think about for a very long time, but it could be very powerful, as in we could work together and you could find that actually we're using a lot less energy or we're contributing it collectively. If you get that wrong and you just think of it as an engineering challenge and not also a social and cultural challenge, then you could end up with this kind of J.G. Ballard style nightmare where we're arguing over electrons across the corridor, you know. So very interesting.
In the original picture, right?
That's a real street. No, that's a real street. But yeah, it's funny, isn't it? So these are White Gum Valley. This is led by Development WA, so the Western Australian government, as a prototype. So it's kind of interesting. And of course, there's similar things here as well. But this is a participative way of dealing with energy. You could also see mobility happening. I think these little autonomous shuttles in Finland are probably the most far end of that. But they're kind of a form of public transport, but they could be owned again at a community scale and just be trundling around doing odd jobs for you. So this is kind of strange because it's a self-driving shuttle. It's far more likely a cargo bike network is something you'd share at a local scale. But these are also interesting because they enable a form of public transport that otherwise is quite expensive. The most expensive thing in a bus usually is the driver's wages, and so that's why if you need like 3 drivers to make a bus work, they don't tend to happen in rural environments, and so people in rural environments have to have a car accordingly. But these could shuttle you backwards and forwards from the train station, or when it's raining, or if you're elderly or carrying a big canvas or something. You know, they could just be doing odd jobs around other things. And so they kind of fit into a gap. Key thing in this context is, again, we don't have to make that scale to work across all of Melbourne, or indeed be like Uber and say, oh my God, it also needs to work in Seoul and Shanghai, try and take over the world. It can just stay local to your community or neighborhood, which is intriguing. Parking lot as social fabric. This is Ron Finley's amazing work in Los Angeles, looking at vacant parking lots. He's leading incredible work there. There's something like 26 Central Parks worth of vacant parking lot in LA. He's figured out he could grow 724 million tomato plants in food deserts there, essentially, and he's working with communities to do that. So this is growing food at the super local scale in a highly participative way. So again, it's not just making tomatoes, it's also making social fabric at the same time. This is lovely work by Studio Sidiana, and designing a space for people and birds at the same time with the sort of same level of priority. So this place is designed for ducks as much as humans. So participative in a wider sense would include involving nature as part of the participants here. Julia Watson's work looking at indigenous landscape technologies and infrastructure, she would say massively interesting, because obviously there's a much longer understanding about working with infrastructure and landscape, and I would call them things like Budge Beam actually as technologies in a way. They're also landscapes. They're all spiritual and cultural and infrastructural and technological all at the same time. They wouldn't separate them out. Highly participative, obviously. They only work if you feel that you have a kinship relationship with them. So it's deep, deep participation in that sense. We could learn a lot. Planning practices, this is what I did in Sheffield, just explaining the plan in a way that makes sense to normal people, not planners. So we redrew the whole plan with cartoons and things like that. And that old guy was saying that he remembers his granddad used to move cows into the city in the top left-hand corner. That would not have happened if we hadn't redrawn the plan as something accessible. So there's all of these ways of doing participation too. And then this is a platform we built when I was in Finland about how would you open up spaces in the city and make them available to people. And we were testing the idea of crowdfunding, almost critiquing it as well, because it's not necessarily democratic to crowdfund stuff. But to the idea of having a way of saying, you know, holding your phone over a building and saying, why is that vacant? Who owns it? What could I do there? Is there any electricity in there? Could I get in there for 2 weeks and do something like this? Or do I have to take out a 2-year lease? All of that stuff is completely opaque, as you know, so it's not participative the way we handle it at the minute. And then this would be some of the, the stuff we did with everyone every day, which is the streets, which leads me to streets as gardens. This is a kind of participation in Tokyo because there's no on-street parking in Japan at all since 1965. So the streets are just fluid, open spaces. And Japanese culture then means that, if you give a Japanese person 50 centimeters, they'll try and grow a forest in it, basically, but they won't go to 70 centimeters. So it's just, there's a combination of culture and regulation and possibility there that's hugely taken advantage of in the best possible way. So that leads me to the work I was doing in Sweden very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, but this was a kind of participative process to say, how do we transform all of the streets in Sweden? So we're saying, like, the outcome, we need to make streets healthy, zero carbon, or sustainable, and full of life. And life could be like, Little Berg Street on a Friday night, full of life, or it could be just full of butterflies and bees. Either way, they're both life, but either way, just not dead. So the first thing we did was actually participation with people in the system, if you like. So the woman on the right works for the scooter company. The bored-looking guy works for the municipality. He was actually very engaged, nice guy, Matthias, made the whole thing happen. So I just got him at a bad time, but he was good. And the guy on the left works for Ericsson, and the guy on the right is an air quality expert. But they're both scribbling together on what the street might be like, and that's really important, getting the stakeholders in a participative mode. And then we found streets to prototype with, and we found school streets, and we let the kids design the streets. So this was 6-year-olds actually designing their own streets. And we said the street belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to the traffic planner in the town hall. What does he or she know about that street? This street is actually, it's for the kids in this case, and the people that live there and the people who might use the street. So complex, but interesting. And so you let the kids do that, and kids are amazing designers. We also did that with the Prime Minister, that's him on the left, but kids are better than Prime Ministers at this kind of thing. And this is what the kids come up with, given half a chance. You see fake palms because it's Sweden, they have real palm trees in Sweden. But everything else you can have, and kids are bright and sensible, actually. You know, they would also say bike parking needs to be there, but they also have sandpits and swing sets, which is lovely. So then that was built out in timber as these kind of modular street kit elements, which you could scale up or down the street like boardwalk. There's just lots of wood here, and of course, it's Swedish timber from local forests. That's got all of that going on. But the key thing about the timber was that it would only last a couple of winters in Sweden, actually, and then you'd recycle it. But that gives you a reason to then go back to the street and say, so what's the street about now? Because things change. And our problem is out there that we've made streets in concrete and steel as, you know, as if it's still 1982. It's not, right? So things change, culture changes, also technology, like scooters come along, and then what do we do about them? So you have to build that in there. So it's a kind of a continuous learning prototype that's predicated on the core idea the streets belong to the people. You could imagine it happening here with the communities around this in the same way. So it continually enables you to ask questions together. We asked the artist Brian Eno to write some design principles for it, and the key one there is, other than make places that are easy for people to change and adapt. So that is a condition. You have to make things adaptable if you want people to adapt it. Was to the first one, think like a gardener, not an architect, design beginnings, not endings. So get cracking on something, get it rolling, get people involved in it. And gardening became a really nice metaphor for me to work with, because gardening is a participative act. It's you plus the nature, plus the weather, probably plus your neighbors, you know, plus your neighbor's dog, whatever that might be. So you can have a plan for it, an idea, but basically it's slightly out of control, and you're going to be nudging and nurturing it. But, you know, and it's got to do a couple of things like streets. It's got to do errands and epiphanies, as Rebecca Solnit calls it. So the epiphany might be the chance meeting with someone that you then get married to, or and that also happens in streets. But it also has to have milk deliveries, and, you know, or get people to work. So it's this delicate balancing act between possibility and culture, and a space like this coming out into the street and all the possibility within that. It's also just to get people to where they're going, and so that's complex. As Nikita Oliver said, it's actually easy in a way to open up the idea of quick change, but then how do you make it serve the community over time? That's really hard, and that's why, again, you need to really rethink those structures. So my last two slides was, one is this thought that might be useful for us if we're having a conversation. It might not be. I'm testing this out in public. It might be a terrible idea, but just to say there's a way of thinking about this at different scales. I call this street stuff the 1 minute city scale. So the scale right outside your front door, that's the thing you've got an intimate relationship with. It's me and my neighbors. We can decide to plant tomatoes there, totally. You know, so each of these things, greenery, shared garden, we can decide that. We don't have to ask the mayor to do that particularly. 15-minute city, that's kind of interesting. Maybe that's the scale of community gardens and local parks, just for thinking about greenery. 60-minute, that's the scale of wetlands and giant things and Royal Botanic Gardens, you know, things that this is a more representative mode of decision making. This can be very participative at this end of the diagram. It's like it's up to us, and we need to make it work, and we're going to be doing the maintenance and pruning the tomatoes. That end of the scale, that's why we sort of invent government and things. You know, we elect people to make those decisions, and you know, elect professionals to make those decisions. This interesting bit in the middle is kind of blurry. And what's interesting, I guess, is that for too long we maybe had the representation culture dominating the participative one. So we haven't been able to just step out into the street and plant tomatoes, actually, because someone would come along from the council, and tell us that there isn't, you can't do that, there's a bylaw against that as well. But that's the same culture that you're designing at that end, and you're applying it to this end. And you can see things like energy, which all used to be at this end, big coal-fired system, now can be at the microgrid end. Football, we can decide to play football. If anybody's got a football right now, we could kind of have a game in here, no problem. But national stadium, that isn't something that we can make, with all due respect to all of you. I'm sure you're all very capable. So it's kind of this is sort of a way of thinking about participation, and where participation is super useful is, you know, this end, and these things are moving around in interesting and complex ways. And it might stretch quite a long way that way. But at some point, it stops being possible to just run it on individuals working together. You know, it's just, it doesn't end up making a cathedral or something. That's really hard to make. You know? And so the last thing there is then, you need people to help with this as well. You can't just load it all on individuals. And so to some extent, the policymakers at that end of the diagram need to be learning from being actively involved in the gardening, and they should be facilitating people, I think, and enabling them and learning from it. Because if you find Callan comes up with a brilliant idea and it works super well at his street, why would we not then test that then with Nicole's street? That's the kind of thing you want the policymaker doing. So you have the policymaking following the practice of experimentation and prototypes and participation, not the other way around, not stopping it. And the last thing then is, you also then need designers and others, not just designers, I'm a designer, so sorry, but other capable people exist, highly capable people. But these kind of the local GP, I think, is a very interesting model, because it's a kind of a professional person, a general practitioner, a doctor. They're often organized at neighborhood scale. You can have a relationship with your doctor at that scale. He or she knows you and your ailments and your foibles. And they can do like 15 people a day like that, just giving them advice. But then if you need surgery, then go to the hospital, that end of the diagram. But this end of the diagram, it really works, right? But we don't have architects that do that. We don't really have other designers that do that. We might have people in the community that do that informally in an ad hoc way, but it's not really built into the way that our systems of decision-making work. And that would be really interesting, because, you know, again, you could have then someone saying, oh, I'm interested in solar cells on my roof. How does that work? Who maintains them? You know, is that a good idea? Or I need to work from home. How do I take my garage and enable that to become a space I can work in? And just those little alterations, additions, nudges, retrofits, kind of the things that doctors do to bodies. But what's that for communities and neighborhoods? So again, it doesn't have to be an architect or a designer, but whatever that role is, I think that's a kind of a missing bit of the infrastructure. So participation. Thumbs up for participation. But then, like, and there are things moving up and down those scales. I think I do have a slide for that, essentially. So those social infrastructures, my last point, they're really interesting. Libraries, swimming pools, streets, playgrounds, community gardens, like what parking lots, what you do with them. They're super interesting nodes, because they're the shared bits in between where we live usually. Those are the places to load this in, and we need to really start rethinking the way that we think about that from a policy and a practice point of view, government point of view, citizens and neighborhoods. How do we build the capability for that to start happening? I'll leave it at that. Thanks. Sorry, I went on a bit. So let's bring up your slides, Kate.
Thank you. Oh, no, it's so fine. Thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. That was a really nice way of setting the scene for going into elements of the case study that I had originally posted about. Mine goes into two examples, but more deeply a little bit into participatory city and everyone every day. But I do want to definitely allow time for us to chat about these things and so on. So as I said before, caveat, I did not design this piece of work. I'm just sharing it, okay. So, and also before I start, I did actually want to start by acknowledging the traditional people of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also those people that are listening at home, the lands in which they are on, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I think respect, recognition and protection of people, culture, land, species, human or otherwise, and so on, is very topical and thematic within thinking about participatory ecosystems, because it's thinking about the things that we share, the things that we care for, the commons, etc., how we use, how we govern those things that we share. And so I think that that is definitely something also to be thought about as part of this approach. So just like organic models, participatory ecosystems are made up of organisms and species that interact with each other. And it actually sent me down the road of looking at permaculture, which I remember Emma studied, and looking at these kind of amazing diagrams of root systems and so forth. And I think keeping that in mind and thinking about all the kind of living organisms and the soil and so forth of a city and of a place is a nice way of keeping it alive in your mind. And the qualities that it shares of other organic models are this, the independence and diversity of parts, the things where there's emergent behaviours, properties and so on, the fact that it's adapting, learning, evolving, moving, shifting, and that there's organic natural growth and renewal patterns in there. And this is actually, I should acknowledge that this has come also from the way everyone every day have expressed, and Participatory City have expressed the way in which participatory ecosystems are to them. To jump forward to another example, which, who in this room has heard of Civic Square? Okay, yep, so a number of you. It has the amazing Imi Kaur involved in it. If you don't follow her on Twitter, soon to be shuttered, but like if you don't follow her on Twitter, you should. She's a very prolific tweeter. She shares a lot about what they're doing at Civic Square, but also with regards to what they're doing with the donut economics community up there in Birmingham. But they actually have a creative and participatory ecosystem, which they have been thinking about and working on for collective action. They have the idea of this front door that you can kind of come into. It has similarities to the everyone everyday example I'm going to share in a minute. But that idea of a threshold, an easy to entry threshold that's right around you in your area, where you can enter in, meet with other people in your community and be exposed to the kind of participatory things that are around without it feeling scary, essentially. So these are welcoming, encouraging places. And I just quickly jump to this, the participatory ecosystem that they're working on there, and I think it might have been put on hold briefly because of obviously pandemic, but also other things they've been shifting gears into focusing a lot on doing work with donut economics and so forth, is that they have been developing this with Dark Matter Labs. And I'm sure that some of you have heard of Dark Matter Labs. You would probably recognize, well, this is probably one of their older styles of illustration, but they're very good at doing this kind of, what do you call it? Isometric. Yeah, and what I've done in sharing these things with you today is just pull out the elements that I find interesting. So as a designer, I'm like, and also someone working in this food strategy, food systems now, it's like, what are the qualities or what are the conditions that are forming part of this ecosystem that they have been conceiving? And this is part of their theory of change and development here. But there's very much this focus on meeting with residents, being at the ground level with citizens and so on, and the keywords are building alongside and learning from local movements. So not creating something new and asking them to come to us as the group, if in this case Civic Square, or I'm thinking about the not-for-profit I work for, Street. We're not making it and making them come to us. It's very much about how can we grow and learn alongside these movements. The idea of the collective mapping and dreaming futures together. And another thing I'll just add in there for the mix is follow the work of Phoebe Tickle and Moral Imaginations, Moral Imaginaries. I don't know, there's lots of different things. Twitter, it's a minefield. There's so many things. But the community coming together around social issues. But also I think this talks to some of the things that Dan picked up on as well about co-creating the social infrastructure. The fact that when put into place, these ecosystems as well can act as these kind of local economic multipliers. The work we're doing at Street with Moving Feast, which I'll talk about a little bit at the end, is also looking at the job pathways and the various things that can be stimulated by citizens being part of these things as well. It can open up new opportunities, capability building, skills sharing, that kind of thing. But one thing I think here touches on themes that also come up in groups like with Regen Melbourne and the discussions we're having about things in Melbourne here is these things of regenerative models, regenerative financing, like, whoops, signal lost. Back. Okay, cool. Circulating capital and particularly sort of alternative forms of capital and funding and so forth. Things around civic data and civic decision making. So this language, if you're familiar with the work of Dark Matter Labs, you will recognise this kind of language coming in through their writings. Also recommend going off and looking at them. But this is on the Civic Square site, so you can go and actually have a look at it. But again, this is just about kind of pulling out things that I find interesting just to throw into the mix. So moving on to Everyone Every Day, which is AKA Participatory City, because Participatory City Foundation, or the group behind it basically. But Everyone Every Day is the working operational model in the borough of Barking and Dagenham in London. I think, and don't quote me on numbers on this, there's, as I said, there's 2 400-page total reports you can delve into. Equally, Dan and Sarah from Everyone Every Day, I told them I was talking today, we did the case study together. They did a presentation at DemSoc. They said, any questions you have, they'd be more than happy to field. We could probably run another session with them. They'd be happy to dial in, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think there's been sort of thousands between 2017 and 2019. I think it's something like 3,500 residents in this particular area were involved in this program. It is basically a running on 2 interconnected systems, a participatory ecosystem, which is the top bit you see here, which I'll just read it out because it's very small, but it says a collection of many and varied practical participatory culture projects and collaborative businesses. And then at the bottom, it has a support platform, which is a collection of coordinated shared infrastructure. And I think the key thing I learned from reading about this piece, not having designed it myself, was that the two are very much interconnected and one can't exist without the other. So one is like the air supply, so to speak, for the other. But the way that the participation ecosystem works is that is where there is a way, there's low thresholds, very much on the doorstep ways for people to directly step into things that they can do that are connected with their daily lives without it being scary. Because I think the idea of like participation and saying, someone coming along like a city government or like maybe a social, a civil society group saying, you know, we want you to come and do all this stuff. It's going to be amazing. It's going to change your life. Like some people are like, oh my God, you know, so like, how do you meet people where they are? And I think that's what I really like about this example of everyone every day is that it's thought very carefully about fitting into people's existing lives. Basically, they can walk in, pick up and do something very much just in that way. The support platform is more of the engine, as I understand, where you have like this committed teams or this big teaming, I think is the concept behind it. And I keep looking at Dan because he'll probably know more about these things than me. Cool. And that's where you have also this coordinated shared infrastructure. And I think this is also where we need to think about what can be leveraged. Again, to come to Melbourne, it's like, what can we leverage in terms of the different access points, the different things we have existing systems running in the city. But also that's the thing that makes it easier to keep this thing going, to maintain it, to support it and so forth. And so those two things run together. And then diving further into the participatory ecosystem, this is basically the way in which it has been composed to express the way that it works. So the idea is that you have these factors, which I thought they're like health factors. I've forgotten what it was. I actually wrote that down. But there's different ways in which it basically conceptualizes these community factors, biological factors, individual factors, and interpersonal factors. And those things are also looked at in terms of how it's evaluated. And there's this very sort of amazing, I thought, like evaluation framework that sits under this that we'll see in a minute too. But the idea is that there is direct and immediate benefits to individuals. There's also the collective benefits and the network effects. So the idea of amplification in different ways is also very present in this thinking. This looks a bit like a cleaner version of what Dan showed, where they're like an architect, your colleague, has squiggled onto there, like where certain things could go in the place. So you can see the different examples that are here. Oh, there's an accidental logo up there. Well, shout out to my old organisation. Hi, Gemsite. I did present this to them as well. So you can see in this particular space, in this neighbourhood, you have a project shop, you've got a kitchen, there's digital manufacturing, there's makers workshops, etc., etc. If you go on the website, you'll be blown away by the amount of things that they have available on there, which are just amazing. So here's some examples. So they kind of group it. It's a nice information architecture that they've got running here. So they group things by like cooking, eating and chatting. So there's a tea and toast it's called. So tea and toast is almost like the lowest threshold, you might say, where you can go in, pop in, speak to your people from your neighbourhood, from your streets. You can then also hear about opportunities for things that are occurring in the neighbourhood that you might want to connect with. That is actually in the middle there, a business enterprise that was established by members of the neighbourhood coming together and actually establishing these working opportunities together. They also have things to do with, as you can see here, growing, composting, bees and chickens and so on. And there's a lot of things that fit under that theme as well. They have sharing and mending. They've got ways of creating art that expresses what you feel about your neighbourhood and sharing that with others. There's also things that connect different generations of kids with older people and so forth, and are ways to bring the streets to life. So I would say a lot of these examples, and there's so many of them on their website, align nicely with the things that Dan has been sharing too. And just to show you these participation opportunities, and what I really